Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to our special edition talk show today, Doctor to Doctor in the chat room, dedicated to Mental Health Awareness Month. I'm your host, Dr. Rhonda Shaw, and I'm excited to have you guys back yet another Saturday. You keep doing this, you keep coming back, and because you keep coming back, I keep having the opportunity to do this work, and I thank you so much. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the importance of mental health, breaking down those stigmas, and sharing valuable resources and insights. Before we do that, though, I want to encourage you guys, as I always do, take real good care of yourselves, your holistic selves, your physical self, your mental self, your emotional self, your spiritual selves. Make sure that you are good. Make sure that you are doing good for you. All right. Mental Health Awareness Month is observed every May, and it's a crucial time to bring attention to the mental health issues affecting millions of people worldwide. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, approximately 1 in 5 adults from the United States experience mental illness each year. This means that mental health concerns are more common than we might think. It impacts our families, our friends, our communities in very profound ways. Despite the prevalence of mental health issues, there's still a significant amount of stigma and misunderstanding surrounding mental health. And this stigma often prevents individuals from seeking the help that they need, exacerbating the challenges that they face. So during this show, we aim to shine light on these issues, promote understanding, and encourage open conversations about mental health and remove those stigmas. Okay? Here are some really compelling statistics to consider about mental illness. Anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the US, affecting 40 million adults ages 18 and older, which is about 18.1% of the population every year. Depression is the leading cause of a disability worldwide, with over 264 million people affected. Suicide, the second leading cause of death among individuals aged 10 to 34 in the US, highlighting the urgent need for effective mental health interventions. So, throughout today's show, we'll be talking with Jessie Fairchild, our expert today, sharing personal stories, providing information on how you can support your own mental health as well as the mental health of those around you. We'll discuss common misconceptions, talk about some of the warning signs, explore the roles that mental health professionals play in providing support and treatment. We'll also highlight resources and services available to those that have mental health concerns. We'll discuss how communities and organizations can work together to promote mental health awareness and support those in need. Whether you're tuning in today because you're personally affected by mental health issues, or maybe you're looking to support a loved one, or you just simply want to learn more, we're here to provide that information and the support that you need. So settle in and get focused and join us for this enlightening and important conversation on mental health so that we can work together to break down those barriers and foster understanding and support mental wellness for all. So, as we get ready to get started, I want to introduce to you our guest today, our wonderful guest. She has been here before. I guess it's been about a year now. Jessie Fairchild. She is an integrative client focused therapist with a theoretical orientation rooted in psychodynamic theory and contemplative psychology. Her goal is to create a compassionate space for healing both with individual clients as well as the community at large. She works with each individual, couple, family, or agency to help them build on their existing strengths. Jessie is an LCPC and practice owner of Bodhi, which is a mental health private practice that engage with the surrounding community to offer services to children and their families that have been affected by intergenerational cycles of trauma and substance use disorders, while also engaging with Cecil County DES to offer support to first responders. And I tell you, We are honored to have her today. No better person to help us have a discussion around mental health awareness than Miss Jessie Fairchild. Hello, Jessie. How are you?
I am well, Rhonda. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's so good to have you back. I know it's probably been a year or more since we've done this, right?
Yes, yeah, I think about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything new since we last talked?
No, same old, same old. I think we're doing a lot of the same work. I'm doing a lot of the same work, maybe a little bit more engagement with first responders.
Mm-hmm.
Um, doing a lot of work with supporting them on an ongoing basis and also stepping in when there's critical incidents and they need some extra support due to difficult calls.
Yeah.
But continuing to build out the supportive families and trying to engage all the systems in our county in trauma education and help them understand how we can all support each other
Mm.
in mental wellness.
Yeah. That's awesome. I'm so glad to have you here for Mental Health Awareness Month.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is an important discussion, and I know you do as well.
Mm-hmm.
I really want to just kind of start with, why is it important to dedicate this time to talk about mental health awareness and raise awareness about mental health issues?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I think at the end of the day that there's been a long history of people sort of being aware of maybe mental illness and feeling like you have to rise to that level of mental illness in order to seek help or support. And I think having, a mental health awareness month, we start to shift that conversation towards health and wellness and ongoing support so that people don't end up in a position of needing more intensive services and kind of
Yeah,
recognizing that everybody, yeah, we all have mental health, right? We all have mental health that we need to stay on top of and find ways to improve over time.
yeah. It's really, excuse me, it's really interesting to me. It seems like no matter how much attention we bring to mental health awareness,
Mhm.
no matter how many analogies we give about, we take care of our physical bodies and we should take care of our mental health as well. It's just like if something's wrong with my heart, I go to the heart doctor. Or
Mhm.
sometimes we go for preventative things to our doctors about our physical health. And no matter how much we say about it, there is still, it's still such a taboo topic,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And I wonder what causes it to be such a taboo topic. Why?
Wow, that's a really good question. It's wow. Ultimately, I think like psychology is a really young science, right? Like you're
Hmm.
you're only talking about, I don't know, 150, 200 years tops of people actually thinking about this and starting to look at it. And I think so we're learning more and more, right? And I think people just don't have an awareness, right? That's the need for the mental health awareness month. I
Hmm.
think the less we know about something, the more fearful we are of it, and so the more we avoid it, and don't really engage in trying to learn more or try to get connected. We're fearful of that. So I think that's a lot of what keeps people from seeking that help.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. I reflect on how I grew up and
Mhm.
in a household where, we went to church and if something went wrong, you were supposed to pray about it. And then
Sure.
when you talk about being more educated, the more I learned about it,
Mhm.
mental health that is, then the more I truly experienced the impacts of good mental health and it just bringing about a more significant wellness to my overall being because when you feel good mentally you think even if you're not quite well if you may have some other issues or whatever but it's nothing like feeling down mentally it just has an impact on the rest of your being and
Yeah.
so I think that's the reason it's so important for us to get more information about it.
Yeah, well, I love that because I think what you're kind of well, you tapped into a lot of things there. I think, we have all these systems that used to take care of us, right?
Mm,
Church, schools, community organizations, different things like that. And I think we've kind of moved with maybe with the more interconnectedness with technology and stuff, we've moved away from that in-person interconnectedness that we used to have with social organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we lose that connection, our mental health suffers, right? And
Yeah.
so I think finding ways, new ways, additional ways to engage and to get support and to talk about things, you do kind of get it in the same way you would with physical health. You can, you can be ill, you can be not ill, or you can be well, right? And the same thing works for mental health. I can be mentally ill, which I kind of struggle with that term, but
Mm-hmm.
mentally ill, have a mental disorder, have some dysfunction, distress there, or you can be like not ill, or you can be well, you can be mentally well, and we can start to build our capacity, increase resilience, and find ways to be even healthier, right? So
Mm-hmm.
not just keeping ourselves from being sick, but actually finding ways to be really well.
Really well. And you
Mm-hmm.
know what? If in all transparency, I struggle with that. I
Mm-hmm.
struggle with, making sure I'm holistically well.
Mm.
I do. I do. I mean, somehow, and maybe that's, through lived experience, I I think more about my physical health, and if something seems off, I attend to it in whatever way I feel I need to.
Yeah.
If I'm feeling down, say I'm feeling down mentally,
Mm-hmm.
I expect that to just be okay with time.
Yeah.
Sometimes I
Fix
do
itself.
I do
Yeah.
believe I'm better. I do believe I'm better, and I think
Mm-hmm.
I'm better because of the types of this discussion. These types of discussions, right, make me more aware and more attentive. And I just hope that whoever is listening to this discussion today, that's probably what I want everybody to glean from this discussion more than anything, is that you cannot be well, and it's okay to acknowledge that, and it's okay to get help. It's okay to
Yeah.
talk to somebody.
Yeah. No, I think that's so true. And I think it sort of speaks to the interconnectedness of all things too, right? So we look at again that idea of how we're engaged in social organizations, but also internally the interconnectedness between my physical health and my mental health, right? Like we
Mhm,
know more, and I am not a scientist, so don't go
mhm,
quote me on this one, but
mhm.
we're learning more and more about how neurotransmitters begin in the gut and move to the brain, and kind of all
Yeah.
these, the body is in tune with the mind, and I think our physical and emotional wellness are very much tied together. And so
Mhm.
when one is off, the other is off, and finding ways to engage both and really show up. And I think there's been a really, there's been this big push, right, for like check on your strong friends and all that. I think that's also, we've been through a
Whoa.
lot, in the
Yeah.
last, I don't know, decade, lifetime. So like there's a
Yeah.
lot going on in this
Yeah.
time that we live in. And I think a lot of things we're starting to see the effects of trauma, the effects of marginalization of groups of
Mm.
people,
Mhm.
and the effects of trying to right those wrongs, right? It's messy
Wow.
business. It's hard to start showing up and being different. There's a lot of discomfort in that and a lot of distress. And so finding ways to have space to talk about that and to work our way through it as we find the path forward, right? As um, individuals and as a groups.
Mhm. Mhm. So let's talk about the misconceptions and the misunderstandings around mental health, and just how we can work to break down those barriers.
Mhm. Well, I think a lot of it, like again, there's this great movement where you hear people talking about like, oh, my anxiety or my depression, or I'm dealing with this or I'm dealing with that, right? And kind of using a lot of clinical terms to describe just everyday occurrences, right?
Mhm.
Which is wonderful because we're talking about it and it's bringing it to the forefront. And
Mhm.
but it also may be, if I say anxiety, what are you thinking about versus what am I thinking about? What does that look like for me versus
Interesting. Yeah.
you?
So are we using these terms kind of loosely, you think?
I think we're like, it's almost, when you say a word over and over and all of a sudden you're like, that doesn't even sound like a word anymore. Like I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
kind
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
collectively we're doing that. So now
Mhm.
that we have to we've found a word, we're using it, and now we have to go back and redefine it so that people
Mm.
really understand, what am I talking about when I say
Mhm.
anxiety, or when I say trauma, or when I say um, mental health, or whatever I'm doing. We have to be more specific with our words,
Mhm.
I think,
Mhm.
and find ways to talk about it, because I think it's gained in awareness, but now we've also sort of minimized some of the meaning behind that. So I
Yeah.
think it's just like a continuing, one of the things that pops to mind, I see people all age ranges. I don't see as many children nowadays as I used to, but I remember I had one client years ago who was under the age of 10, and they were like, I got to go to my talk lady. Like, I got to talk to my talk lady, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's what it wasn't, like the mental doctor. It wasn't, it
Mhm.
wasn't this idea of a counselor or a therapist, but I was the talk lady. And so
Yeah.
this child knew, this is where I go to talk about things, to just put them
Mhm.
out there and kind of roll them around. And I think that's what's important in mental health, right? Conversations,
Mhm.
discussing, talking,
Mhm.
showing up for each other in that way, whether it's professionally
Mhm.
or personally.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, because when you were talking, I was thinking about how many times I've probably used the word depressed.
Mhm, mhm.
You know, like I was just so depressed the other day, and I
Yeah,
not, but not saying it from a clinical perspective necessarily,
right.
but just saying, and then how subjective that is, right?
Mhm,
What
mhm.
what that means to me versus what it means to someone else. Very interesting. Can you provide some insight around the prevalence of mental health in our society today?
Sure. I think the numbers that you see thrown around the most are kind of this idea of 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people are dealing with mental health disorders, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
diagnosed mental health disorders. So you're talking 20 to 25% of people meet criteria. So like when you say like, oh, I was feeling depressed the other day, for me, when I hear depressed, I'm like, okay, so how's your mood? Are you not doing things you used to enjoy doing? Are you isolated? Like, there's a whole clinical kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, say 20 to 25% of people are really dealing with that clinical experience of various and sundry disorders. And it varies by, there are some disorders that are less prevalent, some that are more. Um, but I also think if you took into account kind of that subclinical picture, right? People who are walking around feeling distressed but may not meet criteria or may not know they meet criteria,
Oh
I
yeah.
think we've got a much higher number. And I think, for me, a lot of the conversations I have with like agencies or with, well, in our county, people in positions of leadership, right, to be able to say everybody has something, right? Like when we talk about trauma, I mean, yes, there are people that meet criteria for PTSD or acute stress disorder, but at the end of the day, we've all had at least a moment in our life where our resources, our internal and external resources, were overwhelmed with whatever was in front of us, and those are the things that really need support and counseling or therapy, right? And I think the idea behind that being like there isn't anybody who, I mean, maybe there's a couple people, but for the most part, everybody could benefit from some sort of mental health support, whatever that might look like for them.
Yeah. With that said, I'd love for us to talk about some of the warning signs and symptoms for someone that might be struggling with
Mhm.
mental health issues. We'll talk about that when we come back from break. We'll be right back on Doctor to Doctor in the chat room right here on 94.7 FM in just a moment. And we are still here with Jesse Fairchild. We are talking about Mental Health Awareness Month, shedding some light around mental health and mental wellness. Let's talk about some of the warning signs and symptoms that somebody may be struggling with a mental health issue.
Yeah, so I think, oftentimes it's someone around, like someone adjacent to someone that notices what's going on. And I think at the end of the day, the number one thing I would pay attention, if somebody seems different, right? Something's off, something's different. You just sort of have a nagging idea that there's something going on. I think it's worth asking, bringing it up. I think people like to know they're noticed and that people are
Mhm,
paying attention.
mhm,
Um, Basically, overall, you're looking at changes in thinking, changes in mood, or changes in behavior. Those are the three areas. So if somebody's, they used to be pretty positive and all of a sudden everything's negative Nelly, that's worth noting. if they're just cranky or irritable all the time, or excessively happy, like excessive sort of manic or really excited about things all the time. Or if their behavior changes, they're late to work, they're missing work. They used to, go out all the time and now they're not going anywhere. So any changes really is what you want to be looking for. And listening, I feel like sometimes people will say, or a lot of my clients will say, and I've even experienced it myself, where you say to people around you, like, I'm not right, I'm off, I don't feel well. And they're like, you'll feel better tomorrow. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's worth saying, well, what's going on? What do you think is happening? Right. And kind of delving into that and actually having the conversation.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, how do you approach somebody about it if you do see something that's off?
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's important that you talk a little bit about here about suicide because
Sure.
um, you know, and the importance of addressing that with someone and how we tend to think that if we ask about it, it pushes somebody to commit suicide.
Yeah. I think I certainly don't know of any cases where somebody took their own life because someone asked them if they were thinking about suicide. So I
Mhm.
think all the research shows that it's important to be very direct. Are you thinking about killing yourself? Do you have thoughts of harming yourself? Are you suicidal? Asking it a couple different ways so that people really recognize what you're talking about. I think when you dance around it, the message really is, I can't handle this and I don't want you to tell me, right? And so
Mm,
it's a bit of a silencing response, right? It's a way
yeah.
of protecting ourselves. We keep somebody
Mhm.
else from talking about those things. Um, but there are, there are some people who have fleeting thoughts of suicide that would never in a million years act on them. There are people that are constantly struggling with those thoughts and fighting them
Mhm.
and trying to figure out how to make life worth living. So you've got a wide range of people that might be dealing with that. And there are very real circumstances, physical health issues, aging, housing issues, other stressors where people may feel suicidal because they're feeling trapped and they don't know what to do. I think on average, people don't necessarily want to die. They just don't want to feel what they're feeling right now. And so I
Mm.
think if you open a door to conversation to say, I'm here and I'm willing to help, let's at least get through today. I think you start to make a difference and then potentially that changes the outcome.
Yeah. You talked a moment ago about, most of us are dealing with something, right?
Mhm.
So how can individuals support their own mental health and well-being during those especially challenging times in life?
Mhm.
And then you
Yeah.
said something just then that really stuck out to me. You said aging. And when I heard that, I often in this space of life think about my grandmothers who I was especially close to, right?
Yeah.
And how because of where I was in life, I didn't think about death.
Yeah.
But when I looked at them, it just seemed that they'd live forever. So
Yeah.
back then, I had no idea that they could possibly be thinking about death could be near and how they were maybe
Mhm.
struggling with that or maybe not. I don't know, but I
Yeah.
never thought about it. Now in this space in life, I'm almost 60, and I'm thinking about, as my grandmother would have said, I've got more life behind me than I
Yes.
do in front of me, and there's a
Mhm.
different lens, right?
Yeah, no, that's so true. I think a lot, it's all perspective, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think I'm 52. How old am I?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 52. Well, I'll be 52 this year.
A
Yeah.
youngster.
I'm in my 50s. And I think there is, I want to say around like 45 or something, there was this real understanding of like, oh, I think I
Yeah.
might have, like, I just walked over the top of the mountain there.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's
Mm-hmm.
all downhill from here. And it's not, it's wonderful. I mean, for me, every decade has been better than the last, right? I feel
Mm-hmm.
more
Yeah.
myself and I
Mm-hmm.
feel better about life in general. But it is a different perspective. And I know, and my mom is 93, and watching her age, and you talk about grandparents, I think also 20, 30 years ago, it was more people were kind of aging in the home. More
Mm-hmm.
people were, we sort of pack folks away now and have
Mm-hmm.
them, they're
Mm-hmm.
somewhere where they're being taken care of, but we've
Yeah.
had a lot of trouble with, um, you know, employment and keeping those places staffed. And there's just a
Mhm.
lot, again, our systems
Mhm.
are getting really taxed right now.
Mhm.
And so I think it was maybe more of a natural approach to old age in the past. And I think um, there is just something, it's like you turn a corner and you see something you didn't see before, right? And you're like, oh yeah, I guess I'm approaching that too. That is
Mhm.
where we all head, right?
Mhm.
Um, but so I think in terms, and that's, I think that's part of what you keep in mind, right? As that's part of your experience is, where am I in life? What are the tasks of this age, right? Like, what am I
Mm.
struggling
Yeah.
with? What am I
Yeah.
learning? What do I want my life to mean? And then there's kind of the daily, day in, day out, how do I care for myself? Um,
Mhm.
which is, I have a, I do trainings on like healing the helpers and taking care of people who take care of other people. And part of that is really around self care.
Mhm.
But I always say, I mean, I've been very known to say that self care is BS, because I think it's very hard to show up for self care if there isn't community care, right? So
Wow.
for me to take care of myself, if I need to step back from what I do in the world, and take care of myself, especially for helpers, for first responders, for therapists, for people, nonprofit people, whoever, people who are showing up with a community oriented mindset. It's very hard for us to step back and do self care if somebody hasn't stepped in to pick up the mantle, right?
Mm.
Um, so I think it's kind of two pronged. I need to be doing everything I can to support people around me so that when they need to take self care, they know they can do that, and what they do in the world will continue. And then I think for everything we can do around our own ongoing preventative um, self care in terms of planning ahead, thinking about it, knowing what I need, knowing what works for me, because my self care looks very different from yours or from somebody
Mhm.
else's, right?
Mhm.
If I,
Mhm.
yeah, a big thing for me, self care wise, I have to make sure I have quiet time in my day. I have to make sure I have
Mhm.
time where nobody's talking to me, nothing's
Mhm.
happening around me,
Mhm.
and it's just empty space. And if I don't have that, I'm a bit of a mess. Or I need time to read. I love to read, and it's very soothing and productive for me. They're
Mhm.
internally productive, and so having that in place, or travel.
Mhm.
Other people have other people may need to be around people, right? Or go to church, or go
Yeah.
be involved in some
Yeah.
community organization, or play board games, or whatever it
Mhm.
is. So
Mhm.
I think it's like, what are the things that fill me up, and how do I make sure that I'm spreading those throughout my life so that they're there consistently as I need them before I need them.
So I will put this on a T-shirt. Self-care is BS.
Self care is BS, said Jesse Fairchild.
I tell you why. I tell you why. Because what I've learned in the workplace,
Uh-huh.
and this is not just unique to one workplace. What I've
Hmm.
learned is it's a check in the box. It's
Yes.
something that people say because it's the right thing to say. We want to make sure that you're taking care of yourselves. And
Mhm.
in the next breath, you're overwhelmed with loads and loads of work, or
Yeah.
you're afraid. I've known situations where people were afraid to ask for a day off.
Yeah.
They have a time accrued, but they are afraid to ask for it, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So it is BS. And I think, you talk about our systems being taxed. Yes. And I think many of them are broken.
I think, yeah.
Yes.
I think they're crumbling, right? I think,
Yes.
and not
Yeah.
to like incite panic. I think new ones will evolve. I think this is
Hmm.
the way of the
Hmm.
world. Pat
Hmm.
Rowan talks about things fall apart so that they can come back together, right? They're like,
Interesting.
we need it to sort of fall so that it can get built back up in a way that's more meaningful.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and the self care, I mean, I'm a business owner, right? And
Hmm.
I don't know that I always do a great job of encouraging self care because um, I wish I did. I hope
Because
I do.
there's a need. There's a need.
Yeah, and if I encourage, if we as therapists, if we take time off suddenly without warning, we're potentially leaving people in the lurch, right? Who may have
Mm,
a very real.
very
I do
interesting.
a lot of grief work, right? So if I
Hmm.
suddenly disappear on my clients, that may trigger a whole cascade of things for them. So it's being mindful about it and being aware. And I think when you're trying, and I say trying because it's very hard to achieve, but when you're trying to be a trauma informed, trauma infused organization, trauma respective
Mhm.
organization, it's really hard, right? It's really hard to figure out, how do I support my people while also knowing that there is a job that needs to get done and people need help, and how do we show up and
Yeah.
find creative solutions to that. And it's um, I, for what it's worth, I recently, my sister died in December. And so last year was a lot of time spent going and trying to take care of her. She had cancer, and taking care of her while she was ill, and then being with her when she died. But also, I still had work to do, and and it was really hard to be caught between those things, right? And figure out, it didn't work for me to just disappear, right? Just go to my personal life and take care of that. But it also didn't work to not be present for her. So it's complicated. We've all the easy stuff is done. We found all those answers. We're left, our generation, our this lifetime is really around finding ways to work through those more difficult, more complicated, complex problems, and that's
Yeah.
we have to be honest about that. And I think that's part of mental health too, right? To show up and say, there isn't an easy answer here. There isn't a simple treatment plan, do X, Y, and Z, and you'll feel 1,000 times better.
Mhm.
It's like, let's keep kind of cobbling it together to try to build out capacity and resiliency, and ways of finding meaning in our suffering, and in what we walk through.
Yeah. You've kind of touched on this a little bit. Talk about what do the mental health professionals, what's the role that you play in providing support and treatment for individuals with mental health concerns and disorders?
Sure. I think it's varied, right? So there are different types of, if you've met one therapist, you've met one therapist, right? If you met one, even what we call ourselves, we're all kind of differently trained and differently educated.
Mm-hmm.
There are many, many ways that we show up in the world as mental health professionals. So there are people working in agencies that don't ever do therapy, but they're infusing agencies with an awareness of mental health, and an eye to that piece of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are those of us who are counselors who do, there are some people who do brief interventions, not my jam. It's hard to do, to solve something in 8 sessions, but there are people who apparently can do that. They're,
Mm-hmm.
they try to kind of put the band-aids back on. There are people who do crisis intervention. There are people who are doing long-term, kind of more what I do is long-term supportive therapy, finding meaning, depth psychotherapy. But there are lots of ways. We run groups, we engage in advocacy in our communities and on a national level. Like, there's lots of ways that I think people in the mental health field show up and try to support people.
Mm-hmm. During the introduction, I talked about Bodhi and the work that you do. How did you land where you are
Oh,
in your focus areas?
life has handed me those focus areas, right? So
I get
I
it.
I completely, I try, a door opens, I go through it, has sort of been my mantra. But I, soon after, when I was getting licensed back in the day, um, there weren't a lot of pathways for private practice. So I worked at a methadone clinic, a medication assisted treatment center,
Mm-hmm.
for people struggling with opioid addiction in Baltimore City,
Mm-hmm.
and got a lot of really good experience there, and really loved working in that, with that population in that
Mm-hmm.
area. But it's heavy. There's a lot. There's a definitely a deep and wide problem in Baltimore that they're trying to address, and we were part of that. And then I shifted into private practice, and so I had this, substance use training and experience. Um, Started working with families who had been affected by substance use. So thought that experience of working with um, people who were struggling gave me some voice, some experience, something I could add to the conversation for families who are dealing with that. Then
Mm-hmm.
had my own losses personally. I lost a cousin and a niece to opioid dependence. Both of them overdosed,
Mm-hmm.
and died much younger than they should have, clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I shifted away from working with people who had active substance use, and started trying to support families and community engagement, to help people really understand. Um, I think it sort of became really important to stop vilifying
Mm-hmm.
substance use, and kind of help people understand that usually when someone's behaving badly, whatever that, whether that's drug use or alcoholism or aggression or any of those things, it's usually because they're hurt and we missed something long ago, and trying to find ways to support people who are in that position, but also keep people from, kind of going upriver to keep people from falling in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that, and then lost a client to suicide in the same year that I lost my father to old age, really. And so started doing a lot of grief counseling and working with people who had non-normative grief. So
Okay.
losses to suicide, homicide, sudden death,
Mm-hmm.
unexpected death. And then once I was doing that and then engaging with other people, then started working with the first responders, because I really recognize in our community, particularly being a rural area, we're heavy hit in the state of Maryland, where our county was second only to Baltimore City in terms of substance use data
Mm-hmm.
and overdoses. And our first responders were being hit really hard. And I noticed we were asking them to show up. We weren't
Mm-hmm.
taking care of them. So then I kind of jumped into that. So that's sort of how it's evolved. Just every time when I see a gap, I'm like, oh, well, I'm going through there. Let me see what I
Yeah.
can do with that.
Yeah. Awesome. I want to ask this question, and I don't even know if I'm phrasing this the right way, but is there, what is, or is there a correlation between mental illness, there's that word again, and um, substance use disorders?
Yeah, I mean, we have the idea of co-occurring disorders, right? Where somebody
Okay.
may be diagnosed with both substance use and a mental health disorder or mental
Mm-hmm.
illness. At the end of the day, I don't know that you can boil it down to just one thing, but ultimately it's probably trauma, right? Which also is a
Mm-hmm.
word we're throwing around these days.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Dr. Bruce Perry really, in my opinion, his book "What Happened to You" is really informative and really helps us understand, how the brain develops, and how when an infant or a young child doesn't get what they need developmentally, which kind of happened to all of us in one way or another, but how that happens, how often that happens, how consistent or inconsistent parenting was, or how needs were met, that then leads to these other issues later in life, right? Because ultimately, I have a firm belief whatever's going on with you in adulthood that's your struggle, it
Mm-hmm.
probably was the thing that saved you when you were a child, right? So whatever you
Wow.
needed, right, to like
Huh?
come through that family of origin. So if you had parents who couldn't be available, right, or um, were unable to be constantly there with you, or constantly affectionate or something, then maybe you grow up and you're really independent and you're really sort of like by yourself and you handle things, and you're a type A and you get things done, right? I'm like
Yeah.
so generalizing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you're a people pleaser, it's probably because there were people who needed to be pleased, right? There were things you were doing in that family. And then when you come out into the real world, all of a sudden it's like that doesn't work anymore because you're not in that family. And so
Yeah.
I think, yeah, and the more we learn, I get so excited about this stuff, the more you learn about epigenetics and intergenerational transmission of trauma and substance use and abuse, and it's like all these things really boil down to that we carry a lot with us, that's ours, that's our family of origins, and that comes from generations before, and it all affects us. So like, um, in the book "What Happened to You," they really should give me money for this book, because I tell
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's
every client, I'm
they
like, you gotta
should.
read this. I carry it with me everywhere. I do book groups. But at some point he says everything matters. Like it all
Mm-hmm.
matters. It matters
Mm-hmm.
differently and how you interpret it and what you do with it.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people will read this stuff and they'll think, oh my God, I failed my children, or there was that one time I let them cry it out and now they're
Yeah.
and so but the truth is, I think the other side of it is we have every opportunity in the world. Every time I interact with another person, I have the opportunity to be kind, to be caring, to be compassionate, to be empathetic, to smile, to be gentle, and I can begin to repair some of that. And so, on the one
Yeah.
hand, everything matters, but because if we're trying to do it all, if we try to show up as many times as we can, as positively as we can, without it being like toxic positivity. But we really can make a difference and we could change the world bit by bit if we all show up for it, you know?
Wow.
So I think there's a
Wow.
lot of hope in that.
Hmm. So I want to talk about some specific resources and services available to individuals seeking help for
Mhm.
mental health concerns. We'll do that. We're at another break. When we come back from break, we'll be right back on Doctor to Doctor in the chat room on 94.7. We're still here on 94.7 FM, Doctor to Doctor in the chat room, talking to Jesse Fairchild about Mental Health Awareness Month. You're going to share some resources and services available to folks that are seeking help for mental health
Sure.
concerns.
Yeah. So, one of the great resources if you're looking for like therapy, right, trying to get connected with a therapist would be Psychology Today. They have on their website, you can search therapists in your area. And of course, our area has expanded now that most of us are doing telehealth. So,
Mm-hmm,
as long as someone's licensed in the area you live, they can provide therapy even if they're somewhere else. So, I think that's a great way to find people.
and that's so important to know because I've known therapists that I would have considered, but
Yeah.
you being one, but not in my area.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and a lot of us, there's a lot changing in the world of counseling. So it's different for every licensure, but for counseling, we have a counseling compact, and they're trying to make it where it's a little easier to get licensed in multiple states. Like I'm
Mm-hmm,
licensed in a couple states and have telehealth registration in others.
mm-hmm,
It's kind of a pain,
mm-hmm.
um, but they're trying to improve that. And so I
Okay.
think, seek people out and see who you can find and look for somebody that you feel something when you see them, right? And that you
Mm-hmm,
kind of like have a sense of this feels like it might be a good
mm-hmm,
relation. And also for everybody, if you go to counseling and sometimes it may take a few sessions, it might feel a little awkward because you're sharing things you never shared before. So
mm-hmm.
sometimes it can be a little anxiety provoking. You kind of want to push through that a little bit. But if it isn't a good fit, find and keep looking and tell your therapist, like, this doesn't feel like a good fit to me. It's
Mhm,
not podiatrist. Like you do have to feel connected and feel like engaged with the therapist for it to work well. I think fit is really the best predictor of success.
mhm,
Um, and the other resource that I think is really important for people, maybe more in crisis, would be the 988 hotline, right? So it's great that we have this national hotline. You only have to remember three numbers, 988. It takes some of the weight off of the 911 centers. And it will connect you to your local crisis response, whatever that is, or to the national crisis response if there isn't one in your area. So if you're feeling really not well and you need to talk to somebody quickly, that's what I would suggest is dialing 988 and seeing what they have for you.
okay. How can communities and organizations work together to promote mental health awareness and support those folks that are in need?
Yeah, well, they can start by reading What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry. Is so good. Um, I think it's leadership, right? I think people in positions of leadership at whatever level trying to find ways to educate themselves and to have conversations around mental health is really important. Recognizing that the healthier your workforce is, regardless, right, or the healthier your community is, the better all of it will go, right? We want healthy
Mhm,
people showing up.
mhm,
Um, and I think it's a lot on the part of also mental health professionals, right? Finding ways to advocate and connect in their community and provide resources to people that normally wouldn't get it, right? Where Bodhi is a private practice, we take, private insurance and out of pocket, but we partnered with the county to be able to provide our services to people who might not otherwise be able to afford that. And so in doing so, there was the real focus on how do we figure out how to, like, really my goal is that every person understands they have the ability to improve someone else's mental health
mhm,
just by virtue of connecting.
mhm,
And the more, because mental health professionals can't do it all, there aren't enough of
mhm,
us.
mhm,
And the more everybody recognize that I am impactful on others and I can be impactfully positive on others, right? And so doing more of that and showing up in that way, I think is really important.
Can you don't say you don't have insurance,
Mhm.
you know, but and I know you have the 988, you can call 988,
Mhm.
but are there organizations that service folks with mental health concerns where they don't have to worry about paying out of pocket. They don't have to worry about insurance.
Yeah, that's so. I think most communities, certainly not all, but most communities will have something where they have a sliding fee scale, or they
Got
have,
it.
they have like a community health center or something that can help you get insured to be able to get services. And it's an imperfect system at best. Like I get that. I'm not trying to say it's super easy. And when you're struggling mentally, right, it's hard to jump through all those hoops. So,
That's right.
but I think trying to see what is available in your community is really important. And to go back to your other question, I think one of the ways that organizations, agencies can really help is, the people who make decisions about healthcare, right, or health
Mm,
insurance. Making sure there's a good mental health package, right? Making sure that there's EAP services and that people know about them and know they can use them without being penalized.
mm-hmm.
Engaging mental health providers to come do trainings. I've done some trainings at various organizations in our area, which are larger organizations, just around grief or around mental health, like whatever. Um, the more you talk about it, the more people feel comfortable talking about it themselves. So I think,
Mm-hmm.
again, if you're in a position of leadership, being able to be the voice of mental health in your particular agency is really important.
Can you talk about any recent advancements or initiatives in the field of mental health treatment and research?
Mm. Yeah, I think ultimately it's this arena of trauma, right? And we're understanding more and more the somatic side of it, the body, how there's different way. I think about. I used to think about this with substance use, but now I think about it with mental health too. There's a million ways to end up in a position where you have mental health issues, right? Or where you have a substance use disorder or something like that. There's so
Mm-hmm.
many pathways um, leading to distress, right? And so we have to have that many pathways out. And so I think there have to be a lot of different ways of showing up and engaging with people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we're learning more and more. And so no one thing is the answer. I think um, gosh, if there was one thing I could change in our field is that a lot of times we think we've found, this is it. Like now we know everything, and you're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, there'll be more. We're going to learn more, and it'll change. And um, bit by bit, understanding how it all works it's really hard to figure all that out, right? There aren't any tests really that show you. Um, but I think we are understanding more and more about how trauma affects us, how intergenerational trauma affects us, and how we have to show up individually and communally to try to solve these mental health concerns.
I think the light bulb for me was doing the ACEs test,
Mm,
right? And just learning how we just navigate and move through life with those traumas kind of tucked away
yeah.
somewhere. And you're functionable for a while. And at some point, they just kind of catch up to you.
You hit a wall. Yeah, and yeah, ACEs was really a great study, lots of data,
Hmm.
and really almost something that when you look at it, you're like, well, of course, like of course, if you
Yeah.
grew up in a home where there was violence, if you grew up in a home that was impoverished, if you grew up in a home that experienced um, marginalization on whatever level, right? If you grew up in a home where somebody was incarcerated, if you grew up in a home where somebody had mental health issues or substance use issues, or where someone took their own life, like what seems 2 plus 2 is 4. Like, of course, you would have some mental
Hmm.
health distress later in life. But it really was like putting it together was monumental, and it
Hmm.
really was earth shattering. Um, and I've seen it. Gosh, I was at a conference and I was there with someone who was a retired law enforcement, and we were in an ACEs training. He took the little quiz, and he was like, "Oh my God, I've got a 9 out of 10." He said, "There's
Yeah.
no hope for me." You know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
said, he said, "I'm completely screwed up," or something like that. And I said, "No, you're like, look at all you've overcome. Like, look at what you've done, and how many people have you shown up for, and help them find a different way in that role as law enforcement. Yeah, he was a good law enforcement officer. Um, it does not mean that there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
Because again, I'll go back to Bruce Perry. It always comes back to Bruce Perry. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you and what you told yourself about yourself because of what happened. And then what do we do with that? And how do we begin to build capacity for people to see that when you've been through a lot, you're carrying a lot with you, and you have to figure it out piece by piece and look at it. Take all that baggage out and see what you're carrying around. Some of it's worth continuing to carry, right? The strength, the resiliency, the ability to see others and show up for others because you've been harmed or had tough moments or whatever. But the beating yourself up or the making poor choices as a result of those experiences, those are the things you want to let go of, right? Therapy does that, right? You get to stop and look at all of it and say, what do I want to keep and what do I want to let go of?
Mm-hmm. So I'm struggling with my mental health, right? And I'm very skeptical about seeking help.
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you offer me?
I would say, well, start where you feel comfortable, right? Like, who is there that you can talk to start that and ask somebody to kind of join with you to try to help you find somebody that's a good fit. Um, there is a very real, if with I don't want to say the wrong therapist because, most of us are doing a very good job, but when it's not a good fit, it can do more harm,
Mm-hmm.
Um, if I have surgery and I didn't need it, that's not a good thing, right? If I go to a therapist and I don't get the right type of help, that can be problematic. So I think, and this may be where we talked earlier about noticing signs and symptoms. It may be that it's about being adjacent, right? It's about coming alongside other people. So it's less about like what do you do if you're in the struggle, but what does someone next to you do for you, and how do we help give those people capacity
Yeah.
to show up and say, let me guide you, let me come with you, let me show up for you,
Mm-hmm.
and connect you with somebody who can help.
Racial trauma and mental health. What is it about racial trauma that's far more apparent now?
I don't know. I it's heavy, right? I think at the end of the day, we're really coming to a realization. Again, you look at those ACEs, you look at trauma. There is the trauma of growing up in a home that has violence or aggression or
Mm-hmm.
mental health or substance use or whatever, sadness, all the things. But there's also that experience of growing up in a community where maybe you don't feel safe or where the larger community has marginalized you. And I think we're recognizing that kind of anxiety, that kind of dissonance with the world, what you're seeing on TV or what you see when you go to school or how people talk about something versus how it feels, that is very detrimental to people's health and well-being, and I think we see it in a lot of physical health, groups that have higher rates of stroke or high blood pressure or heart
Mm-hmm.
attacks or these things that
Mm-hmm.
are stress related, diabetes, right? And again,
Mm-hmm.
not a doctor, so like I'll be careful what I try to say I know. Um, but at the end of the day, I think we are coming to a time where we're really starting to look at the effects of things that happened as a result of things that happened before we even existed, right? But they
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
continue to reverberate, and we
Mm-hmm.
have to take ownership of that. And we have to find ways to say, I want to be different. I want to find another way through this. And what can I do? And so I think, here we are in this era of started with things like Me Too and kind of Black Lives Matter and kind of all these
Mm-hmm.
different ways of showing up in the world and saying, you don't know my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you. You hear me. Don't tell me you know what it's like to walk in my shoes because you can't and you won't.
Mm-hmm.
But you can hear what I'm saying and take that for truth. And so I think we're just coming into a time where people have the opportunity to voice those experiences. And hopefully, more and more of us who haven't lived those experiences can listen and then share that even further and do our work to kind of heal some of that. Um, but it's, at the end of the day, when I work with clients, a lot of what we may talk about is if you're in a dark place, you're in a difficult place. Let's imagine that you walked, um, uh, you know, 20 miles into the forest. It's going to take you 20 miles to get back out. It
Mm,
a little easier with some guidance or whatever, but I think when we're looking at that racial trauma and that historical marginalization of people, that's a lot more than 20 miles, so it's
yeah.
going to take a lot more healing and showing up and being willing to hold that and support that for it to become um, healed, right?
Mhm.
Or begin to heal.
Do you think that COVID, the pandemic, do you think that it shed more of a light on mental health? Do you think that more people came out after the pandemic or during this time and season to say, I don't feel so well?
Yeah. I think it made it, I think it highlighted things that were already there that we had kind of patched together, right? All of
Mm,
a sudden we couldn't do that. We were just rolling along. This is the way we do things. This is how it's
mhm,
always been done. You're fine, you're fine, you're fine. Keep going. And then all of a sudden we all weren't fine.
mm,
And all of a sudden we all had the experience of life not allowing us to do what we wanted to do,
mhm,
or having to find a different way to do things because we couldn't do it the way we always had done it. And so I think it was sort of, so part of me wants to say it was like the great leveler, right? Like we all came, but we didn't, because people who were in poverty, it was fairly easy for me to stay home and work. It was lovely
mhm.
to live on a farm. I got to be
Sure.
with my animals. I
Mhm,
wasn't living in poverty. I didn't lose my job. In fact, I got busier. So it did not affect us all equally. And I think being aware of that's really important. But I think that feeling of all of a sudden, like, oh, I can't do what I noted, I can't do what I did yesterday, that was huge, right? And kind of, um, nothing like living in a bit of a post-apocalyptic world in your lifetime. Like it was a
mhm.
really big deal. But I don't think it, in my personal opinion, I don't think it caused problems as much as sort of brought them to light, right?
Highlighted them.
Yeah.
Makes so much sense. Um, it's just such a pleasure and honor to have you. Any final thoughts before we close the show today?
No, I think, yeah, I love coming to chat with you. I think it's great. And I'm glad you're shining a light on all this, right? And opening up conversation around mental health. I think, again, we all have the capacity to make the world a better, safer, kinder place, right? And doing that and talking about things, choosing to show up for the difficult conversations is really important. And so, I hope somebody who's listening to this finds a way to get some support that maybe they've been wanting to get in the past, and that this kind of opens the door for them.
Yeah, I do too. And always an honor to have you. Always an honor to have you guys come back and hang out with me for this hour every Saturday. Looking to have you back next Saturday, same chat channel, same chat time, right here on Doctor to Doctor in the chat room on 94.7 FM. We will see you then.